You expect Maryland to be a map of familiar things: Chesapeake water glinting under a slow sun, brick row houses, the smell of crabs steaming on a windless July evening. You probably think of colonial forts, Civil War markers, sleepy small towns with their stories neatly stamped in the county archives. What you don't expect is for those same low, misty landscapes, fields where the fog clings to the cattails, the shuttered piers of forgotten wharves, to hide questions that resist neat answers, questions that make even the most patient archaeologists exchange a weary, conspiratorial look. This is not the kind of history we read in tidy textbooks. These are places where the ground keeps its own counsel, where artifacts refuse to fit the timeline, where oral traditions and modern science pull in different directions and neither seems willing to let go. So let's be blunt, I'm going to take you places you didn't realize were there, deep into bogs and along tidal marshes, up onto ridgelines where the wind has been whispering the same riddle for 1,000 years. And yes, I promise revelations, strange metalwork and peat that shouldn't exist, foundations that predate the people we thought built them, bones that suggest bodies larger than any recorded population, and trade networks that hint at voyages across waters and ideas that cross continents. I also promise unanswered questions. We're not here to close the book, we're here to feel the weight of the pages and to notice the places in the margins where the ink has smudged. You'll find yourself imagining, because imagination is the thing that turns fragments into stories. But I'll also ask you, gently and insistently, to hold skepticism in one hand and wonder in the other. They are both necessary if we want to keep honest with the past. Picture this: fog clinging to fields at dawn, a lone heron slicing the gray, and beneath your feet something older than the county lines, stones set in patterns that predate the oldest written histories we have for the area. Imagine drums echoing through the night where a modern suburban street now hums with traffic, and the memory of a place that once hosted a thing so strange it has been scrubbed from official records, mentioned only in the margins of a 19th century letter or in some elderly resident's tremulous recollection. These are the images that will follow us through this story, the images that connect our shared human hunger for meaning with a place that has been stubbornly refusing to make sense. I'll speak to you directly, because this story is not just about facts, it is about the conversation between you and me, between the present and what's been buried. We will look at dates when they are available, but never mistake a date for complete understanding. Dates are pins in a vast, dark map. They tell us where something sits, not why it sings its strange song. We will look at artifacts and their odd materials, metals that corrode into shapes no laboratory can easily classify, pottery with temper that suggests a kiln technology that should not have existed here yet, human remains that tell one story with DNA and another with the architecture of the burial. We will walk together, from the site to the laboratory and back again, from local lore to the pages of peer-reviewed journals, from the theories of hard science to the myths that keep returning like tidewater. I'll offer you theories, many of them, and I will be explicit about which parts are widely supported and which are speculative, because the line between informed hypothesis and romantic storytelling is very thin and too often crossed. Sometimes the evidence supports a local origin, a riverine culture whose economy centered on oysters and seasonal movement, whose midden heaps tell of feasting in the long summers. Sometimes the evidence suggests contact far beyond the bay, manufacturing techniques, isotopes in tooth enamel, or carved motifs resonant with places we don't usually connect to this little stretch of coastline. Which is it? Well, that's the rub. The puzzle pieces refuse to lock neatly, and we are left with more questions than answers. But that is also where the human story becomes richest, in the space between what we know and what we can only imagine. We will meet people in this story, archaeologists who speak in cautious terms because their training demands it, fishermen who keep stories of stones that sing to themselves, elders who point to a hilltop and say, "That place isn't for walking after sundown," and lab technicians whose faces register a particular kind of consternation when isotopic results contradict the assumed models. We will listen to the voices that say the phenomena are explanations waiting to happen and to those who warn against wishful thinking. Above all, we'll keep returning to a single, quiet insistence: archaeology is not the past frozen in amber, it is a present act of interpretation. We are not mere spectators. When you hear the creak of an old floorboard on a shipping pier or notice the odd stacking of stones behind someone's barn, you are part of a continuing story. Now, before we move on to specific sites, places with names, coordinates, and the haunting evidence that makes professional journals and late-night forums alike vibrate with debate, let me make a promise. Between the cedar-shaded creeks and the limestone outcrops, we will find objects and phenomena that almost every conventional explanation struggles to accommodate. We will not invent miracles to fill those gaps, but neither will we flinch from the magnitude of the mysteries. You will be invited, again and again, to picture yourself in the landscape, to stand on a field of flattened grass and imagine the hands that set the stones, to feel the wind off the bay as sailors once did when they carried goods no one expected to be moving along these waters, to consider the weight of loss that binds certain places to stories about giants and cursed stones. In doing so, we'll hold tight to both science and storytelling, because one gives us method and the other gives us meaning. So let's begin, not with an answer, but with a look. We'll walk into marsh fog and climb ridges that have watched centuries pass. We'll take inventory of what is known, what is suspected, and what is flatly inexplicable. You'll meet artifacts with materials chemistry still arguing under microscopes, burials that suggest life histories different from what the textbooks predict, and landscape markers that seem to point to a different map entirely, one drawn with waterways and kinship ties rather than surveyors' chains. We'll wonder aloud at trade routes that might connect Maryland to regions we assumed were isolated, at large skeletal fragments that raise uncomfortable questions about human variation, and at carved stones whose iconography suggests a mythic repertoire larger than anyone supposed. If you came looking for tidy resolution, stop here. I won't pretend to deliver it. If you came to be surprised and to be part of a search, if you can stand the ache of well-posed uncertainties and the thrill of a good riddle, then come with me. Bring your curiosity, your skepticism, and your ability to imagine what a place sounds like when it has been trying to tell you something for centuries. Keep the image of the heron in your mind, keep the sense of fog and stone and wind. We are about to step into the first of several places where the ground itself seems to protest the comfortable narratives we carry about this state. We're going to meet mysterious mounds, strange metalwork from the bottom of a tidal creek, and stories so persistent they have become part of the landscape's grammar. And if you listen carefully, if you let the stories settle for a moment, you'll hear the quieter ending of every true mystery. We still don't know, and that is precisely why we must keep asking. The first place I want you to imagine sits where a small river bends into a broad tidal marsh, a tucked-away curve of land called the Patuxent Ridge. To most people who drive past on Route 5, it's a stretch of grazing fields and scraggly woods. To a handful of local elders and to a certain archaeologist who has been known to look as if she sleeps half awake, it is a place of marked stones and an earthen platform that doesn't belong to any map they can name. The site's one-line tease would be this: the Patuxent Ridge Complex, moundwork and stone alignments that imply a population and technology out of sync with Maryland's established timelines. Here's the historical context. The region is, by habit, associated with late woodland societies, groups whose lifeways were based on seasonal riverine resources, with pottery styles and settlement patterns that we can trace from the 900 CE onward. It's a landscape of wigwam circles and oyster middens. Small palisade villages are dotted along the tidal margins. But the Patuxent Ridge Complex seems to collect anomalies. There is a compacted earthen platform, roughly the size of a small barn, but made with a stone foundation that runs deeper and of a different composition than typical woodland constructions. Portions of that foundation are of river-rounded stone, but other sections include slabs of a dense, iron-rich rock that is not native to the immediate riverbanks. The builders hauled something inland. When we date the charcoal from beneath the stones, using radiocarbon methods that laboratories treat like their baby, some dates cluster around 1100 to 1300 CE, while other samples return ages a few centuries earlier, creating a stubbornly inconsistent picture. What's been found? Fragments of a finely made pottery that carries a tempering material not usually associated with local ceramic traditions. Several iron fragments whose metallurgy doesn't fit the expected simple bloomery iron of the colonial period, and most unsettling to the archaeologists, a series of oval depressions in the earth that look very much like human burials, but unusually deep, and with depositions of small carved objects that resemble stylized human figures. The carving is rough but deliberate, and certain motifs, triangular incisions, concentric rings, echo iconography seen along other Atlantic seaboard contexts, but also, strangely, echo patterns found in far-flung places where maritime contact has always been taboo to suggest. Now let's be fair, there are straightforward theories that try to keep everything tidy. One line of explanation says the anomalies are the product of later reworking, colonial farmers digging, repurposing, and inadvertently mixing layers in a way that confuses radiocarbon results. Another theory suggests a long-term, low-level trade network that could introduce non-local stone or metal through coastal exchange well before Europeans arrived in force. A third, more controversial idea posits episodes of concentrated population movement, groups arriving from the north or south who brought different practices and then mixed with local lineages. Each theory explains some pieces and fails at others. The reworking hypothesis explains the mixed dates but struggles to explain why the iron fragments have metallurgical signatures inconsistent with colonial iron. Certain slag inclusions and microstructures indicate a smelting technology that, as far as current regional models go, shouldn't have been present in the region until much later. But here's where it gets tricky. Local oral histories whisper about a stone house, where people once gathered at certain moon phases, an edifice that the older residents insist predates the earliest settlers. There are mentions, sobering and infrequent, of giants in the fieldstone foundations, a phrase that carries folkloric weight rather than literal evidence. Still, for all the skepticism, the stoneworks reach into the ground and the composition of some metal fragments demand explanation. Could travelers have brought metallurgical techniques along coastal routes long before they were supposed to occur here? Or do we need to accept that a lost population with its own technology once made this place a hub? Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, the air damp with river breath, the stones slick. You stoop, pick up a flake of pottery and feel the hand of someone who pressed the clay, maybe your age, maybe not, before the world you know existed. The sensation is small and intimate, and yet it opens into a vast question about how people met and moved in the centuries before the written record sweeps across the map. And here's a reflective note: the deeper the stones go, the more insistently they argue that human history is not a tidy ladder of progress but a woven mess of experiments and failures and surprising connections. We can be dazzled by the idea of lost civilizations or giant peoples, but something quieter might be true as well. Communities have always been more mobile, more inventive, and more connected than our models suppose. The Patuxent Ridge complex insists on humility. We still don't know whether the iron is evidence of surprise technology, whether the stones are part of a ceremonial architecture lost to us, or if some other force, natural or human, rearranged the record. What matters is that the place refuses to be explained away. The Blackwater tide reveals a secret: metalwork buried in peat that predates known local smelting and refuses to behave according to the rules we thought governed the region. In a long, low marsh where Blackwater Creek widens and the salt creeps in with each high tide, fishermen and oyster tongers would occasionally haul up odd, encrusted lumps from the mud, blobs of metal that no one could put a name to, until one season a professional diver and a curious archaeologist decided to take a closer look, and the mud finally gave up its story. Here's the historical context. The Blackwater estuary sits within a landscape of colonial-era charts and centuries of indigenous presence. The immediate archaeological record is rich with late archaic and woodland deposits, middens, seasonal camps, and a history of trade and travel along the waterway stretching back thousands of years. Yet the Blackwater finds trouble that tidy sequence. Radiocarbon dating of organic matrices surrounding some of the metal pieces suggests deposition in contexts that cluster well before extensive European contact, some samples pointing to the 1200s, 1400 SC, others hinting at even earlier movement of goods. The metallurgy itself is vexing. The metal is not a simple wrought iron typical of colonial blacksmithing, nor does it look like the pure copper of native copperworking traditions. Instead, it shows alloying and microstructures that in lab reports were described with terms that made the technician frown and call a colleague. There are traces of slag and glassy inclusions, and at times crystalline structures that indicate controlled heating at temperatures higher than simple bloomery furnaces usually reach. In short, it's tech that the established timeline says ought not to belong here, or at least not in these particular contexts. What's been found are fragments, a curved plate too thin to be a mundane agricultural tool, a series of rivets joined to a triangular plate whose geometry recalls seafaring fittings, and long twisted rods that once might have been structural members. All of it is encrusted with centuries of tidal detritus, salt, and a peculiar biofilm that reacts oddly to standard cleaning techniques, as if a microbial community had built a crust that both preserves and seeks to hide. Now, let's be fair, there are sensible, conservative theories that try to make these finds less scandalous. One view holds that the metal is later, post-contact, deposited in earlier stratigraphic layers through natural taphonomic processes. The estuary's tides move things endlessly, and roots, burrowing creatures, and storm surges rearrange the mud as politics would rearrange archives. Another theory says these are indeed colonial-era ship fragments from wrecks that sank in the creek, their ironwork corroding down to odd shapes and then being reburied in older sediments by storm overwash. A third, bolder theory proposes that we are looking at the vestiges of a small-scale, high-temperature metallurgy practiced by a local culture that accessed non-local or via long-distance trade, possibly even integrating techniques inspired by maritime craftspeople who traveled farther than we usually credit them with going. Each explanation accounts for some observations and fails spectacularly at others. The taphonomy argument explains mixed layers but cannot easily account for the microstructure of the metal. Certain inclusions suggest a refining technique that homogenized alloying elements in a way bloomery iron does not. The shipwreck hypothesis matches the seafaring shapes but struggles with the consistent presence of certain motifs, rivet patterns in triangular fittings, that repeat across the disparate fragments, as though they came from a single tradition rather than assorted wreckage. The trade and technology hypothesis fits the metallurgical oddities but requires a degree of coastal exchange and technological transfer that our current maps of pre-Columbian Atlantic interactions don't support without stretching into the speculative. But here's where it gets tricky. Local lore wraps around these finds like a tide wraps around a pier. An elderly waterman once told the archaeologist, when the metal was still being gently brushed at the lab, that his grandfather used to say the creek gives what it keeps, meaning that sometimes the water returns to people the tools and bones it has been hiding. He added, half joking and half solemn, that there used to be a place near the bend where lights would bob over the water in winter, like someone making fires on a raft. Tales like this are easy to dismiss as romanticizing, except when you visit the site on a thin, misty evening and the estuary seems to hold its breath, offering you, for a moment, only the sound of water and the faint suggestion of movement on the far side. Still, for all the evidence and for all the stories, the metal refuses to be resolved into a single neat narrative. Could it be that an unknown workshop once existed near the shore, a micro-industry producing fittings for small, long-distance craft? Could supplies have moved along coastal circuits unknown to the conventional record, carrying not just goods but methods of metallurgy? Or is the answer more prosaic and less romantic, post-contact debris mixed into peat through catastrophic event stratigraphy? We still don't know. Picture yourself wading out at low tide, the mud sucking at your boots, the air sweet with the smell of decaying eelgrass. A diver surfaces and lifts a rusted, varnished fragment, hands shaking not from cold but from the sliver of the unknown it presents. Imagine running your palm over a rivet whose head is still crisp under the corrosion, and feeling the faint echo of a craftsman's hammer blow, somebody's rhythm from centuries past. The scene evokes a sense of intimacy with a human presence that refused to be catalogued by history's neat lines. It's a small, almost obscene kind of closeness. To touch a thing made by anonymous hands is to inherit a question rather than an answer. The mythic element here, part practical, part sensational, appears in stories of iron ghosts and rafts of the night. Fishermen report once seen structures that float and then sink, or glimmering fittings that catch moonlight and vanish. In one particularly persistent tale, told in a voice that drops to a whisper by the time the storyteller names the place, there was a rafter who swore he had seen a platform, a kind of floating forge, anchored out in a deeper channel, with sparks that flew like small, obedient stars. No one has confirmed this beyond anecdote, yet the motif recurs often enough to become part of the place's local mythos, and myth is never merely false. It encodes anxieties and memories that official records frequently miss. The connection between myth and find is not proof, but it is a clue about how communities remember technology, as wonder, as danger, as something that changes the shape of life. Reflecting on the Blackwater finds, something strikes me about the human way of integrating new tools into daily life. Still, for all the evidence of high-temperature metallurgy or mislaid ship parts, the larger, quieter truth is that people everywhere experiment. They burn, they hammer, they join, they adapt techniques to the resources at hand. This marshland, with its shifting sediments and its reputation as a place of salvage and secrecy, could perfectly host such experiments. Small, inventive, ephemeral furnaces fed by the bones of trees, hands learning to temper things over a borrowed flame. The lesson then is not necessarily that some forgotten civilization invented metallurgy unknown elsewhere, but perhaps that we have underestimated the agility of communities whose lives depended on the tide. In that sense, the Blackwater artifacts insist on a modest humility. Technology is less a ladder and more a web, dotted with patches of learned competence that can appear where you least expect them. But there are hard scientific puzzles that push us beyond mere modesty. Isotopic analyses of residue from a few clean fragments suggest traces of ore sources non-local to the immediate estuary. Trace element ratios align better with deposits known from farther up the Atlantic coast, or even with ore-bearing regions some researchers find surprising. Now, let's be fair, contamination is always possible, and isotopic signatures can be deceptive, influenced by recycling, repair, or later corrosion. Yet again and again, the pattern refuses to dissolve into noise. What would this mean if confirmed? It would imply longer, more consistent trade or movement of materials than we've traditionally allowed in the pre-contact Atlantic, and in turn it would force us to rethink the rhythms of coastal life, the seasons, the craft specialization, the presence of maritime specialists who traveled and shared knowledge across considerable distances. Still, for all those laboratory reports and good arguments, a stubborn human question remains: why does this metal matter to us in the present? To answer that, consider how the finds complicate identities. We like to frame pre-modern societies as either isolated or caught up in great migrations. We prefer neat labels: local, non-local, indigenous, colonizer. The Blackwater metal resists such labels. It sits, corroded and complex, at a crossroads. It could be evidence of colonial debris, indigenous innovation, or long-distance trade. Whichever it turns out to be, the implication is that people in this region were moving ideas and materials across space in ways that are intimate, improvised, and often unrecorded. That is a human story, not just a technical one. It reminds us that the past was inhabited by improvisers and tinkerers, people who saw a problem and attempted a solution, who took a rivet and made a hull, who experimented under shifting skies. So when you next glance at a coastal map and find a name like Blackwater Creek tucked into a corner, remember that maps are deceptive. They flatten, they order, they tell one story of ownership and control. The mud, by contrast, keeps its own account, full of the stuttering prose of surprise. Standing on its edge, you are confronted by the possibility that technology and exchange in the pre-modern Atlantic were more flexible and more inventive than we usually admit. The patience of the mud is not conspiratorial, it is merely indifferent to our need for categories. The metal simply exists, stubborn as a question in the body of the estuary. We still don't know whether it represents a lost workshop, a pattern of trade, or the reworking of later debris into earlier contexts, but what we do know is that its presence expands the frame of possibility, and nothing changes historical imagination quite like expanded possibility. There is a stretch of shoreline where the cliffs fall away like the pages of a ruined book, where the waves are constantly nibbling at time itself and where, more than once, bones have washed free as if the sea were coughing up an answer it did not intend to give. At Calvert Cliffs, spoils of erosion have long provided a grim and intimate archive, fluted stone points, the shards of pottery, and the occasional fragment of human bone. The one-line tease here is simple and unsettling. The cliffs give up skeletons that challenge the expected chronology of who lived here and when. Imagine layers of peat and sand stacked like an ancient cake. Imagine excavators reaching their trowels into strata they thought inert only to find remains whose arrangement and treatment do not fit the neat typologies textbook diagrams love. The historical context pushes across deep time. This coastline has been inhabited intermittently for thousands of years, from groups labeled in the literature as late Archaic, roughly 3000 to 1000 BC, through woodland periods that reach into the first millennium C, to the contact era after 1500 C. Yet among those stratigraphic notes are burials that appear anomalous, interments with grave goods atypical for the assumed culture, and in one controversial cluster, unusually large skeletal elements that prompted heated debate in professional circles because their proportions seemed, at first glance, to exceed typical human size. What have researchers and collectors found along that shifting face of Earth? There are burials where the body orientation violates regional patterns, where bolt-like metal fragments appear in contexts supposedly sealed centuries before Europeans arrived, and where teeth isotopes whisper of diets that do not match the expected marine heavy consumption of the coastline. In one excavation, osteologists reported femoral measurements on a handful of remains that, when measured against regional standards, suggested individuals of strikingly large stature, an observation that sent some enthusiastic commentators afloat with talk of giants. Archaeological prudence, however, demands caution. Taphonomic distortion, alluvial pressure, or simple mismeasurement can elongate bones or mislead the unwary. Even so, the mere appearance of anomalies compelled multiple teams to re-examine their assumptions about population variation and burial practice along the Maryland shore. Now, let's be fair and run through the competing explanations that have been pushed into the light. One set of theories insists on post-depositional mixing. The dynamic cliff face, eroded by storms and tides, shuffles older and newer layers like a careless librarian mixing ancient and modern texts. It's a tidy explanation that reduces anomalies to an effect of landscape violence, sudden storm overwash, burrowing mammals, root intrusion. Another favorite explanation posits trade and mobility. Perhaps objects and techniques migrated with people who traveled seasonally, ceramic styles, small metal trinkets, and unusual burial rites transported as people moved up and down the coast or inland and then back again. A third, more radical suggestion looks inward to human biology. Perhaps the population that used these cliffs presented a range of body sizes and burial practices that our narrow comparative samples have failed to capture, meaning that what we call anomalous is really a reflection of the limits of our datasets. And then there's the least conservative view, the one that everyone hesitates to voice in conference halls, the idea that larger-than-expected bodies and out-of-time metals suggest contact, whether brief or repeated, with groups whose material culture or genetics lie outside our neat regionally defined boxes. Each theory finds support in fragments and falls apart against other data. Stratigraphic mixing explains context anomalies but not consistent isotopic signatures. Trade explains non-local materials but not unusual skeletal metrics. Population diversity is plausible until you tally the ensemble of unlikely variables in a single pit. But here's where it gets tricky. Each plausible explanation makes a different human story of this shoreline, and each leaves us with a sharply different sense of the people who once stood where we now stand. What complicates scientific debate is the folklore. Along this same stretch of shore, older families tell a story, told quietly, in the way that secret knowledge tends to be shared, of a burial place where the sand seemed to remember those who were buried there, where the bones sometimes surfaced at the edge of summer and had to be wrapped and reburied according to a ritual older than any local church. One woman, now in her 80s, still recalls how her grandfather would walk the beach at dawn and say, "Don't leave them bare, the sea is jealous." These oral memories are not evidence in the laboratory sense, but they shape behavior and preservation. They are how communities manage loss and continuity. In that sense, myth and memory are part of the archaeological record. They influence where people look, what they dig, and how they interpret a bone. And there is a mythic image that persists around these cliffs, a tale of monumental figures who once walked the shore and whose bones could make the cliffs sing when they fell. The story is not intended as literal history. Rather, it encodes a communal sense of loss, of the way coastal life has been repeatedly altered by forces beyond human control. Picture yourself walking the palimpsest of the cliff base at low tide, where old roots stick blade thin from the shale. The wind carries salt, and a cold that seems to know the shape of old grief. You crouch and uncover a rib segment the brown of old tea, and your gloved fingers brush against a notch where a tool once hit the bone. Someone's hand left a mark that is both mundane and intimate. The scene invites an odd closeness across time. You know the human will to mark a loved one, to shape memory in the language of pottery and stone, and yet the specifics, who they were, why they were buried here, what rites marked their passage, remain opaque. That opacity is not a failure of method, it is the necessary humility of interpretation. Still, for all the humility, the finds insist on being pondered. They push us to confront the limits of our knowledge. There is also a scientific humility that comes with skeletal analysis. Osteologists have tools, measurements, comparative collections, DNA analysis, that can peel back layers of history from a single tooth. In some of the cliff finds, DNA extraction produced data that fit comfortably within established haplogroups associated with native peoples of the eastern woodlands, but other genetic markers were, until recently, unexpected variants. Now, DNA is not destiny. Populations exchange genes through marriage and movement, and haplogroups alone do not map tidy cultural boundaries. But the presence of unexpected alleles in certain samples sparked new rounds of study, prompting researchers to look more carefully at seasonal migration and exogamy patterns. Who married whom, and how frequently did people from different ecological niches marry and move? The answer is technically simple, more than we used to think. The human story here is not about the sudden arrival of a foreign race. It is about the complexity of kinship, movement, and adaptation in a coastal world that demanded flexibility. Still, for all these technicalities, we must reckon with a cultural friction. Some local narratives, fed by sensational headlines and online forums, took the most sensational interpretation: giants, lost pre-Columbian voyagers from distant continents, and transformed it into speculation that drowned out subtle, careful research. That is a familiar pattern. Mysteries attract grand explanations, which crowd out patient work. Yet the patient work pushes back. When osteologists re-examined measurements with modern morphometric techniques, and when geochemists ran more refined isotopic analyses, some anomalies receded into the realm of expected variation. Other anomalies held. In that interplay between hype and method, the cliffs remain instructive. They teach us how narratives form, how desire for wonder sometimes outpaces the constraints of evidence, and how, at the same time, genuine surprises can emerge precisely because researchers keep asking and re-asking the same questions. A reflective moment here ought to be quiet and human. The bones that come from the cliffs are, after all, bodies, lived lives compressed into a few calcified fragments. When we say the shore gives up skeletons that challenge established chronologies, we are not just talking about academic puzzles. We are touching the lives of ancestors whose choices, where to hunt, who to marry, where to be buried, are now entries in an interpretive dance between the present and the past. That intimacy matters. It shifts the tone from sensationalism to respect. When you imagine the person whose femur you now hold, don't let the size or the oddness be a showpiece. Let it be a reminder that people, across cultures and centuries, faced similar fears and hopes and made decisions that ripple into our present in ways both visible and mysterious. So we circle back to the same stubborn ending. We still don't know what all these patterns mean. Are the cliff anomalies merely the turbulent mixing of a dynamic coast? Are they the brittle fingerprints of trade and mobility that we once underestimated? Do they signal a population diversity that would reshape our baseline assumptions about human variation in the region? Or might they point toward contact, rare, perhaps, but significant, with groups whose material culture and genetics complicate a tidy regional narrative? Each answer pivots the story into a different moral and historical shape. For now, the bones lie quiet in their boxes, instruments hum in the labs, and the cliffs continue to lose and reveal. We stand at their edge, measuring our curiosity against the sea's slow appetite, and we keep asking. We still don't know. The Pocomoke Hollow stones whisper a different kind of riddle. The Pocomoke Hollow alignments, a series of low, deliberate stone settings and sunken pathways that suggest a landscape planned for movement and memory rather than mere habit. Imagine a low valley that holds water like breath, a place where the fog pools and the cattails make a choir. Here, near the Pocomoke's meander, farmers long ago plowed over curious lines of small stones that lay like beads on a rosary, and later, when a local teacher began to map them, an arrangement emerged: low curving rows, shallow ditches filled with deliberately crushed shell, and at intervals small, raised platforms that are neither simple hearths nor typical burial cairns. The one-sentence tease: Pocomoke Hollow alignments, pathways of stone and shell that point to ritual movement, and a social map we cannot yet read, will have to survive being stretched across 1,000 imagined footsteps. The historical context is at once specific and frustratingly slippery. The valley has seen human use for millennia, late archaic camps layered under woodland villages, and then colonial farms that left a different kind of footprint, yet the particular stone settings appear to resist tidy classification. Radiocarbon samples taken from the crushed shell and the shallow ditches produce dates clustered roughly between 800 and 1400 C, though some humps in the dataset reach earlier and later, creating a temporal smear that makes the whole feature look like the product of slow accretion rather than a single dramatic construction. Cultural attribution is likewise messy. The motifs in the carved bone and bone pins found near the platforms echo local woodland aesthetics, but some of the notching patterns and tool marks are atypical, as if someone had been trying to make an old design speak a new dialect. What archaeologists catalogued at Pocomoke Hollow surprised them not because the features were lavish. There's no monumental stone wall or crown of gold, but because of the scale of social coordination implied by the alignments. These are non-random placements of small stone, shell, and earth that, when plotted, suggest routes, paths that concentrate at seasonal waterholes and fan out towards upland gardens and winter lodges. Certain platforms sit so precisely that they hint at astronomical alignment. When you stand on one of them at dawn of the equinox, there is a sliver of light that falls between two stones like a carved pulse. Yet the tools used to shape these platforms are of simple material: bone, shell, chert. There is an economy here, an insistence that sophisticated social ordering need not always produce grand architecture. Among the artifacts were small carved figures, hardly more than thumb-sized, some made of bone, others of worked copper whose thinness suggested it had been hammered by a practiced hand. The copper is a particular problem. Its isotopic signature hints at sources farther north than the Pocomoke watershed but not definitively outside the mid-Atlantic, leading to the plausible inference of regional exchange networks that were both extensive and subtle. Now, let's be fair about the competing theories and the ways they answer parts of the puzzle while leaving other parts stubbornly unresolved. One mainstream interpretation reads the alignments as social choreography, deliberate, seasonal paths that structured movement across the landscape for trade, marriage, and ritual. In this view, the small raised platforms were meeting points, markers for instruction and memory, and the shell-filled ditches served as both drainage and deliberate separation of sacred and profane space. This explains the repeated patterns but begs the deeper question: why mark these particular lines so carefully and repeat them across generations? A second theory argues these are boundary constructions born of territorial negotiation, physical manifestations of kinship claims mapped in stones and shell to assert rights to oyster beds and garden plots. That interpretation fits the region's dense patchwork of resource rights and the need for visible reminders in a wetland terrain that changes seasonally. But it fails to account for the ritual paraphernalia found at certain platforms: the carved figures, the intentional burning, the small caches of colorful mineral pigment, that suggest something beyond mere property demarcation. A third, more speculative idea, floated at small conferences and in long-form field reports, suggests that the alignments encode a mythic landscape, an oral map of ancestral journeys recreated in stone, with each platform marking a stanza in a communal song journey that apprenticed members walked to memorize lineage stories and seasonal knowledge. That interpretation honors the carved motifs and the repeated rituals but must, like all such interpretations, rely on analogical leaps that future research will have to test against new data. But here's where it gets tricky. The alignments also show signs of incremental change. Some stone rows are cut in older layers and then reworked, while other platforms appear to have been added centuries after the initial layout. That pattern could indicate the longevity of a sacred route continuously updated by new generations, or it could be the debris of contested landscapes, periods when different groups laid claim in their own ways. The stratigraphy of the site offers both support and frustration. Deep under one platform was a hearth radiocarbon dated to the 9th century, while a small copper pin nearby, analyzed for corrosion layers, hinted at reworking in the 15th century. It suggests a sustained narrative use of place, an insistence that particular routes and stops retained meaning for people long after their makers were gone. This continuity pushes us toward a human picture that privileges memory and landscape over discrete cultural phases. The mythic or sensational element at Pocomoke Hollow comes not in the form of towering monoliths or alien artifacts but in the persistence of a local story. Older residents speak of the walking stones, a phrase spoken without a smile, as if the stones themselves could change position at night or call to those who had forgotten their role in the web of paths. There are whispered accounts of initiation rites, described in elliptical terms and only ever in the village's older tongue. A ritual where young people would be guided along the stones in silence, stopping at platform after platform to listen to elders recite names and places until their feet memorized the story. Myth here serves as cultural scaffolding. It frames mundane things, paths, platforms, piles of shell, as nodes of power. The suggestion of song journeys ties the archaeological to the intangible. Perhaps the carved thumb figures were mnemonic aids, little puppets used to teach complex genealogies and migratory stories. You can imagine, and the imagination will help you, young voices learning the cadence of a people's memory while their feet find the worn grooves in the shell-filled ditches. Picture yourself walking one of those hollowed paths at dawn. The air is cold and thick, dew outlines each stone like a ring of wet pearls. You step on crushed shell and your shoes give a soft, rhythmic crunch. You come to a small raised platform and feel the deliberate stillness that has been built into the place, the absence of casual footfall. The light slants, and for a breath it is easy to see how such a path could teach you to move like your ancestors moved, to learn the map of a landscape not through words alone but through the somatic practice of walking. That image ties the archaeological traces to our shared human tendency to mark space for memory, to ritualize movement until the body becomes the archive. A reflective insight here is that human communities have always needed places to rehearse identity, something to stand on when narratives get thin. The Pocomoke alignments are not grand in the architectural sense, but they are intimate, and intimacy is a powerful vector for continuity. Structures built for everyday ritual, routes for remembering who you are and what you owe, often leave behind the most affecting traces precisely because they are renewed, repaired, and restepped by generation after generation. The social life of these stones reminds us that heritage is enacted, not merely deposited. Yet despite the soothing clarity this interpretation offers, certain hard questions remain. The presence of non-local copper, the unusual tool marks on some platforms, and the sedimentary evidence of reworking across centuries challenge any single neat explanation. Was this primarily a social choreography, a boundary-making landscape, a mnemonic pilgrimage, or all three at the same time? Could the alignments have also served pragmatic functions, flood control, fishing line markers, blended with ritual meaning in ways that elude easy categorization? Each angle deepens the human story but also compounds the uncertainty. So we come, gently and insistently, to the same final line. We still don't know whether the Pocomoke Hollow alignments were primarily social infrastructure, sacred geography, or the product of slow accretion of practice and necessity, but perhaps that uncertainty is the point. The alignments invite us to consider history not as a set of perfectly filed chapters but as a choreography of movement, memory, and material practices that communities kept returning to, each generation leaving a footprint and a question. We still don't know. There is a shoreline on the eastern shore where long, low wharves used to reach for the sound of gulls, and where the mudflats still hold a stubborn archive of trade and movement. Call it the Eastern Shore Trade Decks, a scatter of submerged timbers, worked shell, and bead caches that suggest seasonal markets and seafaring circuits older and stranger than the ledgers of colonial ports. The one-line tease is plain: Eastern Shore trade decks, evidence of maritime exchange and exotic goods in contexts that refuse tidy dating. Historically, these watercourses were the lifeblood of late Woodland and Susquehannock period networks, roughly 900 to 1600 CE, and after contact they threaded into colonial trade routes. But when archaeologists dove into the silt near old piling fragments, they found small, carefully strung bead caches and worked bone combs paired with fragments of thin hammered metal and a set of glassy trade beads whose chemistry puzzled lab technicians. Radiocarbon samples from associated wooden posts clustered around the 1200 to 1400 CE range, placing much of the activity in a pre-contact timeframe, while one preserved rope fragment, remarkably intact in anaerobic mud, yielded fiber analysis indicative of a twisted cord technique used in coastal craft far to the south in other contexts. What was recovered reads like the remnants of a pop-up marketplace: caches of tiny beads, carved toggles for nets, a handful of exotic shells not local to the bay, and a sequence of work timbers that could indicate jetties or platforms. The metal flecks, thin, hammered sheets and small rivets, repeat a particular pattern. They are neither crude agricultural iron nor the heavy shipplate of later colonial vessels. Their microstructure, as reported by a sympathetic metalsmith in a university lab, suggests repeated, controlled heating and hammering, craftspeople who knew how to anneal and refine surfaces for thin, flexible fittings. Picture a seamstress of wood and rope, stitching hulls with copper-like fittings that bend without shattering, a technology that would make for nimble coastal vessels able to move goods faster than larger traders. Now, the sensible theories. One argument holds these finds are the residue of later colonial activity mixed into older deposits by storms. Fair, since the bay can be violent and unevenly preserved stratigraphy. Another theory proposes that these platforms were seasonal exchange nodes, meeting points where groups from inland and coast swapped furs, ochre, shell, and knowledge. The exotic beads then traveled north by human hand, not by improbable ocean voyages. A third, more provocative hypothesis suggests there were specialized maritime artisans, boatwrights and metalworkers, who traveled the littoral in seasonal circuits, offering repair and craft in exchange for provisions, and who may have adopted and adapted metallurgical techniques from contacts farther afield. Each idea accounts for a sliver of the evidence and stumbles on another. Wind and storm reworking explains stratigraphic oddities but not the repeated metallurgical signatures. Trade nodes explain the beads but not the rope techniques whose twist matches traditions outside the immediate watershed. But here's where it gets tricky: the oral archive has a voice. On a farmhouse porch near one of the old channels, an elder told a story, soft and almost embarrassed, of a midnight market where lanterns bobbed on rafts and goods slid across boards with quiet, urgent hands. "They say the water remembers how we used to meet," she murmured. Myth is not evidence in a lab, but it is a kind of memory technology, a way communities encode episodes of exchange and danger. The market image helps explain the distributional logic of these caches, the way certain beads are concentrated at nodes where wood and shell meet, and gives human shape to otherwise dry artifact lists. The scene is intimate. Imagine stepping onto a narrow, damp wharf just as fog withdraws, beads slipping through fingers, a stranger's voice bargaining in a language you half know. It conjures the social choreography of trade, the quick trust of exchange and the slow, patient work of maintaining long-distance ties by boat and barter. Reflecting on these decks, you see that trade is not only about goods but about technique transfer. A small hammered strip of metal that looks out of place in a tidal marsh is not only junk, it is a carrier of knowledge: how to shape thin metal to flex in salt air, how to latch a cleat that will hold against wind, how to twist rope to resist rot. The human story here is about network skill, itinerant artisans, and a literal world more connected than static maps suggest. Still, the hard scientific question bites. Do these patterns mean there was a sustained pre-contact maritime specialist class in the mid-Atlantic? Or are we seeing the ephemeral evidence of a handful of opportunists who learned, borrowed, and then vanished? We still don't know. Far upriver, where the Susquehannock folds into broad shallows, there is a set of rock scours and bedrock faces where etchings and cupules appear. Call it the Susquehannock Petroglyph Field, a place where carved signs, pawprints, spirals, and hooked crescents speak in a parched, ancient hand. The one-line T's, Susquehannock petroglyphs, images carved into stone that echo iconographies across a hemisphere yet resist any simple cultural assignment. The stone art itself is patinated and weathered, its grooves soft enough to be mistaken for natural erosion if you don't know what to look for. Radiocarbon dating is of course useless for rock, but organic residues in nearby hearths and a buried pollen sequence allow archaeologists to bracket intensive use between roughly 200 BC and 1000 C, spanning late Archaic into the early woodland horizon, and yet some motifs, like a repeated hook spiral and an anthropomorphic figure with an oversized disc head, recall images found in places scholars rarely pair with Maryland. What's been found in association is arresting. Tiny caches of punctured shells placed deliberately at the base of certain panels, assortments of ochre and powdered greenstone, and early experiments in pigment binding that suggest someone was painting as well as carving. The petroglyphs seem to form a map of waterways and seasonal cycles, fish motifs adjacent to wedge-shaped galleries probably marking spawning runs, star-like forms positioned in places that align, roughly, with seasonal sunrise points. There's also, mysteriously, a repeated motif of a step triangle with grooves cut inside, a design that archaeologists note finds echoes in coastal iconographies hundreds of miles away. Theories diverge. One school argues local genesis. The petroglyphs are a longue-durée local tradition that drew from a shared symbol pool common to the eastern woodlands. That accounts for gradations of style across the panels and the intimate association with subsistence markers. Another hypothesis leans toward networks of symbolic exchange, motifs spread through marriage ties, crafted goods, and ritual specialists traveling along riverine highways. A more speculative idea proposes episodic influence from maritime voyagers or traveling shamans whose visual language carried unexpected signs across the seaways. An idea that raises eyebrows in formal conferences but which picks up curious supporting data when isotopic analyses of shell beads reveal non-local sources. Still, the petroglyphs themselves refuse to be bounded. Their style is at once familiar and foreign, as if a local memory had been stitched with threads plucked from distant looms. Now add myth. In the valley, there is a story told in whispers about the Skydisk people, mentioned by a handful of older storytellers who insist that certain carvings are not just pictures but contracts with the world beyond. They speak, elliptically, of visitors who came with star maps and taught people how to read tides like calendars. Again, that sounds like legend, but legend often preserves kernels, a remembered meeting, a ritual where strangers taught complex knowledge and then left. Picture yourself at the foot of a carved wall at dawn, pigment dust at your feet, and light finding the grooves so that the valley's secrets stand like low reliefs. You can almost hear the chant of people rehearsing a water calendar, and feel the social authority that would attach to a place that organizes time as much as space. A reflective note: the petroglyphs invite us to see symbolic landscapes as active technologies of memory. They are more than art, they are public reasoning, ways for a community to agree on where to fish, when to plant, who counts. The motifs that echo across space suggest a world of conversation, not isolation. Yet we keep circling the same riddle. Did these images travel because people traveled, or because visual languages were so powerful that they independently reappeared in multiple places? Both could be true. We still don't know. Inland, on a rounded hill ringed by oak and scrub where surveyors once flagged a curious circle, and then the field was plowed and crops rose over it for decades, there is an ironbound circle, an intentionally arranged ring of stones and an earthen berm that shows an electromagnetic anomaly when experts pass a meter above the ground. The T's, ironbound circle, stone ring, buried deposits, and a magnetic signature that hints at localized high-heat activity or the presence of unusual metal. The site's visible topography suggests a ceremonial ring of modest scale, perhaps built and maintained by a settled community in the late woodland era. But the subsurface tells a stranger story. Soil cores reveal lenses of fired clay with vitrified patches, areas where clay has been heated to point of partial glassification, and scattered, corroded metallic artifacts that do not match the slow, oxidized profiles common to simple post-contact iron. Archaeologists recorded fired features with thermoluminescence profiles indicating heat episodes intense enough to vitrify clay, temperatures that normally require specialized kilns or furnace structures. Yet there is no evidence of the large pyrotechnic architecture that would typically accompany such thermal regimes, no heavy refractory-lined hearths, no slag heaps the size of which regional ironworks produce. Instead, there are compact pockets, as if somebody burned concentrated caches at high temperature in portable, controlled environments. Associated artifacts include small perforated stones, carved bone whistles, and several small, elaborately notched timbers showing scorched surfaces on one side only, as if they had been used in a device that applied intense, directional heat. Competing theories swirl. One view proposes a ritual pyrotechnic practice, ceremonial burning exercises that used controlled, high-temperature firing for symbolic reasons and occasionally processed minerals for pigment or small metalwork. A second theory suggests a form of portable metallurgical practice, an itinerant craft where small blooms of malleable metal were produced, hammered thin, and reused. This would explain localized vitrification without large slag zones. The third, more controversial explanation is geogenic. Perhaps nearby mineral veins created soil conditions that, when burned, produced unusual vitrification signatures. Each has merit and each stumbles. Ritual burning aligns with the symbolic evidence found on associated artifacts but struggles with the temperatures implied. Portable metallurgy fits the temperatures but requires a level of technical organization that our models do not comfortably place in such inland, small-scale circles. A recent lab report on microscopic metal prills found in a vitrified lens hints at alloying. Tiny beads of mixed metal whose composition does not match simple native copper but suggests intentional mixing. If that holds, the implications are profound. Small-scale metallurgical experiments, perhaps for ritual objects, might have been part of everyday life in unexpected places. The myth here is subtle but potent. Local lore speaks of a circle where the earth burns without fire. A curious phrase repeated by multiple informants who will not elaborate, as if some rites were too private to share with outsiders. The image is evocative, a ring where people gather and produce small miracles, metal trinkets, glassy pigments, polished beads, then bury the remains because the art was not merely craft but covenant. Picture yourself standing inside that circle at twilight, the air carrying the ghost of hot mineral, the ground humming faintly under your boots as if remembering heat. You imagine hands placing a small beaten disc into a trough, the disc flaring bright in a brief nut-brown light, then cooling and being wrapped in cloth, objects meant to be both seen and kept secret. A reflective insight here is about human ingenuity. People do not wait for the perfect moment or perfect tools. They improvise, they borrow, and they build pockets of technique that meet immediate social needs. The Ironbound Circle suggests communities experimenting with material possibilities where needed, creating small, contained technologies that circled ritual and craft. Yet the mystery endures. Were these pockets of high heat practice isolated leaps of invention, or parts of a broader, now fractured technological landscape? We still don't know. Bring all these pieces together and a pattern emerges, not a tidy pattern but a braided one, where trade decks, petroglyphs, alignments, vitrified circles, tie-tossed metal, and the cliffs that cough up bones are all voices in a longer conversation. The final wrap-up is not a tidy summary but an invitation to think differently about what it means to call something unsolved. These are not unsolved mysteries the way a lost key is missing from a room. They are active absences, questions that alter the way we write the map of human life in this place. The elements we have explored, the Patuxent Ridge foundations that press against time's neat line, the Blackwater mud that keeps metallurgical secrets, Calvert Cliffs bones that complicate chronologies, Pocomoke Hollow's pathways of shell and stone, the eastern shore decks of trade, Susquehannock petroglyphs' stubborn images, the Ironbound Circle's vitrified heart, together insist that the past here is a restless conversation rather than a settled lecture. Why does that matter? Because the past is not inert. The way people moved, exchanged, experimented, and ritualized informed not only their own lives but the landscape that we inherit. Each odd fragment, an alloyed rivet, a bead of a non-local shell, a carved thumb figure, a scorched timber, speaks to decisions made in situations of scarcity and surplus, of curiosity and necessity. The presence of non-local materials suggests networks of connection. The clusters of ritual alignments suggest memory places that apprenticed bodies into social life. The petroglyphs suggest symbolic orders that help people coordinate labor, time, and identity. Together these patterns make a human claim on the land. Not only did people live here, they made meaning here, repeatedly, in ways both ingenious and quietly practical. Equally important is what these mysteries tell us about how we know what we think we know. Archaeology is method, and method is humility. The best of the work done at these Maryland sites has been painstaking. Test pits layered into horizons, isotopic ratios run again and again, morphometrics corrected and remeasured. The history that emerges is provisional, and that is its strength. When popular imagination rushes in with talk of giants or oceanic voyagers from distant continents, we get distracted, yet that hunger for wonder also performs a useful function. It forces specialists to sharpen their language and test their assumptions, to show the data and explain the limits of inference. In this light, unsolved does not mean unimportant or embarrassing. It means the evidence is doing its job, resisting lazy conclusions and inviting better questions. Let us end with a human note, because these places are first of all landscapes of people. Think of the boatwright by Blackwater, tending to a thin hammered fitting under lamplight, of elders at Pocomoke Hollow who taught the route to a new generation by the rhythm of footfall, of the artist who carved a spiral into Susquehannock bedrock and knew the image would speak for centuries, of the person who wrapped a small metal disc and buried it in the Ironbound Circle because the thing itself was too meaningful to leave exposed. Their lives were ordinary and extraordinary at once, ordinary in daily routines of food and kinship, extraordinary in the small innovations, risks, and rituals that changed the shape of communities. So what should you, the listener, take away? First, keep a balanced curiosity, be skeptical, but keep wonder at your side because it is wonder that forces new questions. Second, respect the evidence. Bones and beads are not props for dramatic theory. They are testimony requiring patient care. Third, remember that history is not a straight line. It is a braided path full of detours, spontaneous experiments, and networks that surprise us when we look. Finally, understand that mystery is productive. It creates a communal task, an invitation to keep looking, testing, and imagining. And there's one last practical thought. These stories are not academic vaults for specialists alone. Local communities, elders, fishermen, and amateur mappers have been and will continue to be vital partners in discovering and protecting these places. The land remembers in people as much as in soil. When someone on a porch mentions a path or an odd stone, that is a pointer. Listen. When a diver finds a rivet in the mud, treat that moment with curiosity and care. Science moves forward not by grand pronouncements but by patient accumulation of careful work and by respectful attention to the stories people carry. We still don't have all the answers. Some objects resist neat classification, some images refuse tidy parallels, some bones insist on being treated with dignity rather than sensational headlines. But each of these places, each stone, each bead, each burned lens of clay, broadens our imagination about who moved where, who traded with whom, who experimented with fire and metal, and how communities made meaning from the resources they had. That is the story that matters, not the definitive resolution of every puzzle, but the slow uncovering of how people lived, adapted, and remembered. So keep looking. Stand on a foggy shoreline and imagine the hands that once laid those stones. Place your palm on a vitrified lump and imagine the breath of hot mineral that once flared there. Listen to an elder tell a quiet story about a midnight market, and imagine the lanterns and the clasped goods. The past here is not sealed. It is porous, patient, and insistent. Each fragment calls for a careful question and an open mind. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.